Welcome again, everyone. My name is Curtis Curry again. I'm the president of SIETAR, Florida. We're delighted to have you here today. Rich, I'm going to give you a formal introduction, and then I'm going to turn this over to you. Rich Griffith is a very good friend of mine, and he is also the executive director of the Institute for Cross-Cultural Management at Florida Institute of Technology, which is a partner of the Erasmus Mundus work and Organizational Psychology Consortium. Dr. Griffith provides more than 20 years of expertise in talent management research and consulting. He is the founder of the IO Psychology PhD program at Florida Tech, and including the international concentration, which Rich says is the first in the United States, maybe the first in the world, Rich? Not sure about that. He's the editor of books internationally in the organizational psychology curriculum, critical issues in cross-cultural management, and in leading global teams. He has served as a guest editor of the journals Human Performance and Organizational Development, and as associate editor of the European Journal of Psychological Assessment. He's been recognized as a fellow by the International Association of Applied Psychology, the Society for Organizational Psychology, SIOP, and as a senior research fellow in the Army Research Institute. His work has been featured in Time magazine and the Wall Street Journal. And he's very creative, I can tell you, from a personal perspective, and is really looking forward to this presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Rich.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I appreciate you pulling this group together, and it's good to see you again, my friend. So just the other day, I was kind of killing some time and came across a YouTube video that I thought was pretty interesting. So Buzz Aldrin, I think everybody knows who he is, but it's the second man who walked on the moon, and he was getting hassled by a moon landing denier named Bart Sibrel, who was kind of in his face and trying to get him to swear on a Bible, and ultimately called Buzz a coward and called him a liar, and Buzz just had enough, flat and knocked him out cold. And I'd have to say there's probably not too many people who would watch the video who didn't think that guy had it coming to him. So, you know, being able to hang out with astronauts is fantastic, but it's nothing new if you're a professor at Florida Tech. We live here on the Space Coast, and a few years ago, I was invited to chair a panel that was looking at putting people on Mars. It was a fantastic experience because we weren't just talking about psychology, we were talking about physics and chemistry and oncology. So it was a really vibrant environment where you had all of these brilliant people from all over the world sharing ideas. And I have to admit, it made me a little nervous. I remember in particular, there was a chemist who was, had somewhat of a strong personality who said, listen, the only thing we need to take to Mars is nitrogen, because there's carbon up at Mars. We can make everything we need out of the chemicals. We don't need to take anything with us. And this idea was not a popular idea. So there was a lot of struggle that was going on and a lot of ego that was going on with the group. But, by the end of the day, we had come up with a few really good ideas that made it into some papers. And if all goes well, might end up being meaningful in a real way in changing, the inhabitation of another planet. So, at some point in time, I started thinking like, well, you're pretty nervous about this. I don't get nervous around crowds too much, but that day I think I had a good reason to be nervous, because the guy sitting next to me was Buzz Aldrin, who had invited me to chair this panel, and I did not want to be the next YouTube star. So, just to give you a little bit of information on my background, as Curtis said, my name is Rich Griffith. I very rarely use the doc. If you're more comfortable with that, feel free, but Rich is just fine by me. I've been the executive director of ICCM since it rolled out just a little more than a decade ago, and it's been a wonderful experience to lead that particular group. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, psychology of the workplace, and I got my PhD in 97. So all that really means is I'm an old guy. So if I can answer questions that fall into that bucket, I'm happy to do so. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, I think the agenda is actually pretty light. What is culture? You folks know that, so I'll have you tell me. I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm going to introduce this concept called a cross-boundary mindset, and then we'll chat a little bit about why I think that might be helpful for a number of different stakeholders. And we'll do a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll put a wrap on this thing. So I thought we might as well get this kicked off in the right way. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about culture and diversity. And to me, I thought it would make sense to pose the question and then get your responses to it. What is culture? So feel free if you want to raise your hand, and Curtis, you can flag them down if they've got them in the chat, or feel free to unmute and just offer your thoughts on this, and we'll cobble together what's a definition before we get rolling. Any thoughts? What is culture? I'm talking to a group of experts here. Would you mind repeating?
Well, culture is a set of values and behaviors. It's a perception, but only if it's in a perception, it's only the value that's not culture yet. It has to show up in your behavior, what you actually do. So it's a combination of attitude, values, behaviors, mindsets, perceptions, all put together.
Perfect.
And all of us in SIETAR are supposed to know what culture is. So it's a little bit too rudimentary question, and that's why there's a shyness to answer.
Yeah, although I think you know as well as I do, I'm not sure that's a rudimentary question. That's a very complicated one. We could be going at that for a long time. But I think you hit on a lot of the important components. We've got attitudes, values. Ultimately, those are going to transmit into behaviors that are more observable. Are there any other elements? Because that's a big chunk of what the formal definition would be.
Well, this is Jorge Bertram here.
Hey, Jorge.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Well, I just finished last month reading a very old book called The Geography of Thought by Richard Nisbett. You know, how Asians and Westerners think differently, and it comes to and stuff like that with already, that's a new look at it, okay? So based on that new research, I think, you know, we should add a little bit of that to the definition of culture.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you at least allude to is bringing geography into the equation. So we might have these differences in attitudes and values. They may manifest in different behaviors, and then if we're coming from different regions in the world, that might drive some of these differences of attitudes and behaviors.
That's correct, and I talk by experience. I'm married to a South Korean, so.
Okay. So even better. We have the academic definition, but we have the sort of real life experience happening as well. Okay. Maybe one more person. I don't want to beat a dead horse. I think, as Syed mentioned, you folks are the experts in this area. But and is there anything that we're missing in that definition? Anybody? Anything? Curtis, are you hearing anything we're missing? Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to get in the debate about what culture is. So literally books have been written on the topic, so we can make it very complicated. And an equally interesting question is what culture is not, because sometimes people ascribe things to culture that perhaps are not necessarily cultural. So, but yeah, that's the foundational question. It's very important.
That's fantastic. It's good to see you too, Voss. It's good to see you too.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Yeah. And I think you hit a really interesting one. And Curtis, you'll have to invite me back and let Voss talk, because that's a good conversation. What is not culture? Because I think a lot of people throw things into that bucket, or they make really quick statements about what are cultural implications that may not really be supported. It might be other influences that are involved. So I think I would be silly if I went farther down this rabbit hole. I think you folks have a very good understanding of what culture is. You've dedicated your entire professional career to the study of culture. You know, one of the metaphors I often use when I'm working with folks who aren't as aware of it is culture is the lens through which we interpret what we experience in the world. So we are able to see things, and we can make the world make sense according to a certain set of rules that we learned over time. Now, the complicating factor is that we all don't have the same lens. You know, we have a number of lenses that we can pull in. Some of them are based on geography, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But there are some other influences as well. Now, I remember some years ago, and I would say it could be a decade or so, I was kind of sitting around, and I don't know why, but the thought occurred to me, wait a minute, culture's not real. it's not like air and water in that it is an objective consideration. It's an abstraction that humans came up with to explain why you're standing on one side of the line and why I'm standing on the other. And that line might simply be, I'm just a punk kid from Northeast Ohio, and you're from Mississippi, or you're from Maui, or you're from Malaysia. But there's a number of reasons why we end up on different sides of this line. And what we've done is we've come up with a name for it. We call it culture. And that had what were really deep implications for both the study of culture, the training of cultural competence, and then cultural interventions that might help organizations, which is kind of where I spend quite a bit of my time. So this is an idea I'm going to explore a little bit today, and I think a good place to start exploring that, we'll talk about some of the research in terms of what happens when we meet an individual that is different than us, that is standing on the other side of that line. So I'll get into some of the cognitive research or cultural neuroscience that looks at this. So if you think about the first milliseconds, 250 milliseconds in which we meet an individual, the first distinction that we draw is this a person or is this an object? Am I talking to a person or is this a shovel? And the very first thing that we do is determine whether or not they're human or not. The very next distinction we make in the next 250 milliseconds is whether they are similar to us or whether they are different than us. And this has profound implications because we actually process information about this individual in different parts of our brain, depending on the answer to that question. If the person is similar to us, we have much deeper processing and we start to look at what are some of the details of the scenario. If they are different than us, then we process the information much more shallowly, and we're open to things like stereotypes that might occur. In the next 250 milliseconds, we form our basic affect about this person. So sort of the caveman version of do we like them or not, a positive or negative affect that occurs. And that's all unconscious, all outside of our awareness. So in less than 3/4 of a second, we go from determining whether or not we know this person to be same or different from us, and whether or not we like them because of that. And that drives subsequent thoughts and behaviors that start to occur. All of this is really due to the functions of the brain. It's our hardware. And the brain, I'm a psychologist, I'll try not to nerd out, but this is where I will nerd out. It's hard for me not to. The brain is such a fantastic tool. It's amazing what the human brain is able to do, and the capabilities I could go on and on about, but the one that it probably does the best is categorize things. And it categorizes everything that we encounter, whether that be objects or animals or behaviors or people in that sense. And the most salient category of the human brain is same and different. It's a really strong categorization, and it makes sense that would be the case. From an evolutionary perspective, different used to mean dangerous. And we're probably one of the only species that has outpaced our evolution. The opposable thumb has really allowed us to do some fantastic things. And in combination with the brain, we're moving a little bit quicker than our chromosomes are. And we're still evolving as a species. It's not like we've stopped. But our ability to change our environment is much more robust than our ability to evolve quickly. So all of a sudden, something that was a bonus for humankind, being able to recognize things as different, being dangerous or being a threat, now is a problem in that we run into different people every day. And this categorization can be somewhat of a problem. But I also think that it's a powerful categorization that if we are aware of it and we build our science around it, that can be quite beneficial to both the study and intervention surrounding culture and a number of other areas as well. What are these areas that we look at? Well, there's a lot of reasons why people can end up on the other side of that line. National culture is a common one, and it's probably why we're all here today talking, is that we're experts in this particular area. But you have what are professional cultures or organizational cultures that are there. We learn certain assumptions based on our training. So these are sort of technical backgrounds. and those cross over quite often. So you get someone from the Army trying to talk to someone from the Air Force. That might as well be someone from Chicago trying to talk to someone from Shanghai. Those are very different worlds that happen, and I think there are a number of these that have come to the forefront more recently in terms of the racial tensions that we're seeing in the United States and on and on and on. So lots of types of differences that can occur. And one that I think is most profound right now, particularly if you're living in the United States, is political affiliations. And so, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are coming from the States, and if you're not, maybe you've experienced this in your home country or something similar to it, but it's getting really difficult to have a conversation about politics, which used to be what was the kind of the fun thing to do. Sit around, you grab a beer, sit down with your friend, and you talk about how you view the world. But those conversations are really difficult to have now. And people are wrapping themselves in the colors of their party. And that's a very salient form of difference that is occurring at this point in time. Now, there's a number of these differences that I've alluded to, but almost all of them have some basis in the literature, or there's academic disciplines that specifically focus on a type of difference. So of course we have the entire field of diversity, which is now sort of moved into what is diversity, equity, and inclusion. In my area, in terms of organizational change or organizational dynamics, you see terms called cultural due diligence that's kind of thrown around. Psychology's been doing this for a really long time, so they got a number of monikers that they use to describe the study of differences that might occur, but we see this in other fields as well. And I'm going to raise the question, as we roll through this, is, are we calling the same thing different names? And is that diluting our ability to study these things well and to solve what are really robust problems that might stem from some of these differences that occur? So at the end of the day, when we start to think about culture, is it really geographically based? Well, there's some sense that comes into play, but it might also have a number of determining factors. And we're getting now into what is a prevailing metaphor that is being used. I hesitate to say theory yet, it's not quite there, but the metaphor of the cultural mosaic, which says that we are the sum of a number of influences that come together that determine what our lens is. And today I'm going to get into what some of those may be, and then perhaps more importantly, I think, is the evidence that underlies this as a very basic phenomenon, not an advanced social phenomenon, which is where we often put culture and diversity as these sort of social areas or advanced areas. I think that there's a much more basic explanation for what's happening. Now, that being said, unless I show some evidence for this, I'm just another old man on a soapbox, because that's just how things work. People stand up and they say what they think. Well, in my field, then what we do is we have to test those ideas. And so what I'm going to do is lay out what is some of the secondary evidence, if you will, that would support this idea that perhaps culture is not a real thing, that what we're seeing is same and different, and we are attributing some different thinking around that might be based on what is some very, very basic neurological differences that are occurring in the people that we meet. So I'll walk you through some of this evidence. The first bit of evidence comes from an area of study that's called change blindness. And this is really fascinating. I think this is an interesting area. For those of you that find this fanciful or you're amused by it, you can take a look for a video. You'll find it on YouTube. It's called The Invisible Gorilla. And it's an experiment that is run by Daniel Simons. It's similar to change blindness. But the idea behind change blindness is to study whether or not we can recognize when a phenomenon has changed when it is briefly interrupted. And I'll demonstrate or at least walk you through how this works. So the experiment goes as follows. So you have the experimenter, which would be the gentleman who is wearing the black baseball hat or dark baseball hat. And he approaches someone who is on a college campus and asks them for directions. During this interaction that occurs, the exchange is interrupted, and you'll notice the two gentlemen that are carrying this piece of plywood, they're going to walk right between the man and the woman who are having the conversation. And when they walk through, the person who has the baseball hat on, the blue baseball hat, is going to swap out with the person who has the black baseball hat on. And the gist of the experiment is, does the woman recognize that she's now talking to a different person? And what's just fascinating to me in general is that, you know, a non-significant percent of people don't notice. So they are now talking to someone completely different in this incidence. And what you might see is roughly 30% of people don't recognize that the person that they were talking to has changed. But what is probably more relevant to the conversation we're having is that percentage goes way up if the individual is from a category different than them. So if it's a different gender or a different race or a different age, you can see that almost 70%, all of a sudden now, that the number almost doubles in terms of the person no longer being recognized as changing. So to me, that's indirect evidence that there may be some of this same different categorization that is occurring. And it comes from this area of change blindness. Another really fascinating one comes from a study around the repression of neural activity that occurs when we start to be in environments that are familiar to us. And then the inverse, which is the neural activity that occurs when all of a sudden we're in environments where it is novel. And this is expressed in an evoked potential called a P3 response. And what happens in a P3 response is that when we meet an individual or when we go into an environment that is different, all of a sudden there is a neurological response to that. And I think the theories there in that are really interesting. The theories are suggesting that that is the brain's way of poking us and saying, hey, you need to update your schema. Your schema is out of date. I think that's kind of interesting when we start thinking about culture a little bit. And this is very robust phenomenon. So this occurs in a lot of different settings. It's not just visual stimuli that occur. Now, it definitely happens there across a number of different visuals that you can have. But what we also see is that it comes from other stimuli as well. So it comes from our olfactory senses. It comes from auditory senses. So when we smell something different, when we hear something different, our P3 evoked potential fires off. And even more fascinating to me is the same thing even happens in dreams. So as we're dreaming that we're encountering something that is new, that we get the same P3 evoked potential response that occurs. So our brain is recognizing the same and different. And what it starts to do is spur some outcomes that I'm going to get into in just a little bit. Now, I'm just going to show you my family photo here, and you know, I hope you find my family attractive. But I'll tell you a little bit about why all of a sudden I'm switching gears into the animal kingdom. So, as I mentioned early on, you know, it occurred to me that this response that we have may not be something that we learned per se. There are elements that are learned, without a doubt, and happy to go down that rabbit hole if you want to, but there are also some things that I thought may have an evolutionary basis. So if in fact it does have an evolutionary basis, we should be able to see this in other forms of animals, particularly those that we share a genetic background with, which chimps, about 98% of our genetic material is the same as a chimpanzee. So do chimps show these same differences or these same neurological responses to same and different? And the short answer is yes. Without getting into it too much, you know, I'll start at the examination of non-human primates in culture. And do they have culture? Yes, they do. So they have theory of mind. They do recognize when they're coming across different groups. They have different behavioral norms that are not genetic, that they have learned, that are associated with group membership. Do they show the same differences from a neurological perspective? Yeah, they do. So chimps have change blindness that occurs, and they experience change blindness in a very similar way to humans. They have the same P3 response that humans have. And as I started to read a lot about animal psychology, what you realize is that these neurological differences weren't just in close animal species. They go pretty far down the line. So we see some similarities even in animals as distinct as fish. So this is a very robust phenomenon that what we're recognizing is the people that we're encountering, or in this case, the chimps that we're encountering, are different than us. And that causes some categorizations that can occur. And you know, what is different doesn't matter. It can be a number of different stimuli that can occur. Now, I've talked a lot about sort of the cognitions behind this, and you know, this gets into the areas, this cold cognition. What's that mean? Is it just thought patterns, or are there emotions that are associated with this? And the fact is, there are both. So, and the emotions that we feel are not necessarily positive. And so when we think of things like anxiety, threat, lower trust, discomfort that can occur, these are associated with encountering environments and people that are different. And you know, this is one of the things I think is fascinating. When you get to talk to a group like yours, you folks went into this field for a reason. You know, from a general population, you folks like different more than your average bear likes different. But still, if we were to take a look at the emotions that you're having and the arousal that occurs when you encounter different, you're going to be higher than your baseline when that occurs. And we may have learned to interpret that arousal in a different way. But the emotions that are coming from it in general are not going to be positive types of emotions that people are feeling when they encounter these environments that are a little bit different. So in a nutshell, I'm going to talk a little bit about the phenomenon, and then we'll transition to talk about the implications. But in a nutshell, what we see is that when we encounter these boundaries, these lines in the sand, in which someone on the other side is different than us, we see effects across emotions, behavior, and cognitions that can occur. These are extremely robust. And when we see things that are that robust, those very well may have hardware implications in that. And if it's hardware, then it's you know, based in evolution. So one of the things that I want to explore a little bit is you know, if this is in fact, if this does hold water, you know, if we're looking at culture in what is a more narrow band than we should, what are the implications of this, and how will this change the science going forward, and perhaps the practice going forward? So, you know, coming from a science background, to me, that's an important element of this, is how do we get multidisciplinary teams to start to examine these particular issues and come up with some of the implications. I'm hoping we can start that conversation today, because I'm sure you all have a number of different backgrounds. So what are the implications here? So to me, this is a very broad issue in that, you know, what we've done now is we've taken what could be a dozen different fields, and we're posing the question, are we all studying the same thing, but calling it a different name? And if that is in fact the case, well, then that opens up the conversation for these multidisciplinary discussions that I was talking about. And if all goes well, we can actually start to make scientific progress. Because this is, I think, one of the more frustrating things that I could say is that we haven't made that much progress. Consider we've been studying these areas for what now is a formal study of these areas for perhaps as much as 100 years, maybe a little bit more, 120 years. We've really not moved the needle very much. I mean, this is something I was talking to Curtis about in the, you know, before we kick things off, but you got people out there now who are proposing, interventions such as implicit bias training, which absolutely does not work. There is zero evidence to demonstrate that it works. And in fact, there's evidence that would suggest that it makes things worse than it really does. So, you know, are we progressing in our science? If we are, it's very slow. It's very slow. So I think if we are teaming up, we're probably more likely to come up with what are robust solutions. If we do come up with more robust solutions, because we're teaming together, what you find is that we're going to come up with solutions that then apply in multiple areas. So these solutions then are more scalable. I've never found an executive that I work with that doesn't like scalable solutions. So if you find someone, you know, if you have one solution that solves one problem, that's great. But if you have one solution that solves 50 problems, that's better, and they'll pay for that. So there's an efficiency that comes from the scalability as well. And then at the end of the day, it's just simpler for the customer. And that's another thing that I find is that customers want solutions that are easily explained. And at the end of the day, I think the nature of what we're looking at breaks down and is more accessible to people that aren't experts in this particular area. Now, what are the sets of skills that would allow people to sort of cross these lines in the sand and be able to do this more effectively? So, you know, my area that I started to study was in the area of cross-cultural competence, but we've got a number of papers that we put out there that say, you know, cross-cultural competence essentially is nothing but a specialized form of self-regulation. And I talked a lot about sort of the cognitive self-regulation. That is one aspect of it. Affective self-regulation is another, where we're controlling our emotions. Okay? The last bucket, if you will, is behavioral self-regulation. Behavioral self-regulation is being able to inhibit a dominant behavior that doesn't fit a context, or to be able to initiate a behavior that it has not been initiated before. So to give you an example, if you happen to, you know, one of the best examples of this that I could think of was Barack Obama meeting some leaders in Indonesia, and was on a receiving line, and Michelle Obama was with him. They were going down the receiving line, and what do you do when you shake hands? Okay? But as you all well know, that's not true in all parts of the world when it comes to crossing gender lines or sex lines. So there are some places in the world, Indonesia being one of them, where people who are followers of Islam are not going to touch a woman that's not their wife. And the president of Indonesia did shake Michelle Obama's hand. And what you saw was really an explosion of anger that came from that region in the world. And at first, what you heard was, well, no, she shook my hand. And if you go back and look at the tape, that's not true. You can see who initiated the behavior. So that's a type of behavioral self-regulation. You would know when you meet someone who is practicing not to touch at that point in time. And I've noticed a lot of my male friends who come from that part of the world, when they meet someone who's a different sex or different gender, cross their hands so that they're controlling their behavior. So let's talk a little bit about these different, you know, I believe someone's dropped their mute. May want to put that back on. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we have. So there are hardware challenges that are associated with this. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, you know, Curtis alluded to this. Hey, everybody's brain is the same. We know that there are some differences by region or through evolution, and cultural neuroscience has pointed those out. But for the most part, those changes are not going to be robust. And we do know that a brain is a brain, and it does certain things. So me being in Florida, one of the best ways to explain this is a golf cart. So I live about 100 meters from the beach. Everybody who lives on my street has a golf cart. It's just what people in Florida do. Now, the other thing that you know, if you know American culture, is if you give Americans something that has wheels, they will race it. They want to win. And that's just what Americans, U.S. Americans will do. So there is a piece of hardware on a golf cart called a regulator, and you can take it out and it will make your golf cart go really, really fast. And I'll tell you what, the folks around this neighborhood have figured that out. So what they've done is they've circumvented the system to get an outcome that they want. And we might need to do that. So when we're talking, so for instance, in an organization, we might need to pull in a part of a system that then overrides the hardware challenge that we might have. So if we don't want people to stereotype, we might need to keep them in control processing if they're going to be rating someone's behavior. And you know, that might be a bars that we're using, a behavior anchored rating scale to try to keep them in control processing. So we've got to be able to defeat the hardware or put systems in place that make it difficult to use the hardware in the way that it was built. And we would be doing that with the brain. The other type of change that we have, I think, is really challenging, and this gets into the software implication. So when you start thinking about software issues, part of the problem that we run into is when we go into automatic processing. The same as a plane when it's on when it's on autopilot, and it's the most dangerous place that you can be in if you're working internationally or you're working across these boundaries. that we have is when you're not paying attention and you're on automatic pilot. That's when you're going to start to make a lot of mistakes, and those stereotypes start to be able to kick in. So, what we've got to be able to do is rewrite the software. And I still find it very enlightening all these years later that Georg Hofstadter referred to culture as the software of the mind. And in many ways, that metaphor still holds true. I know there's some criticisms in terms of the way that the culture was measured ultimately using some of the Hofstadter dimensions, but the concept is very sound in that we can rewrite this software, can be modified, we can get an update, if you will, and that will change the ultimate outcome of how we process different information. And to do that effectively, we really got to start kind of early. And a lot of my colleagues are doing work in this area now, where if you want to change people's software, yeah, you can do it when they're older. I'm an old guy. You can change my software. It's a lot harder to change my software. It's not hard to change software or to rewrite code when you're talking about youngsters. So getting these ideas to the young folks early, that different isn't dangerous, different is delicious, different is the way that we get things done, will allow them to rewrite that software. So, I like reggae as much as the next guy. I really like this song, but it may not be the best way to get something done when we're thinking about a big task in front of us. Instead of all of us going at one problem with our own small acts in different ways, maybe it's better if we team up and we focus and we start using the right tool to try to drop the tree in terms of this cross-boundary difference that has been causing all of us significant challenges for the bulk of our career. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what I was hoping to chat with you about today is, what is culture? And you all knocked that out of the park. I introduced this concept of a cross-boundary mindset, and ultimately, then what are the implications that come from this? So, I'll take time now. If you've got questions or you've got points of discussion, I'm happy to try to provide any answers I can, or in all likelihood, someone in your group probably has a better answer than I do. So thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes.
Basically, what you said, I'm going to try to be short. It's what I call the double cultural perspective. When I used to work for the Coca-Cola company, I noticed that we sat down in a big room and you had guys from all over the world, India, everywhere. They all dressed the same. They all behaved the same. They modified their national culture to fit the culture of the corporation. Then in 1998, I went to Cuba to visit my relatives, and inside the houses, everyone complained about the government. They hated the government. But 2 weeks later, they'll go out and fly little flags because they needed the government with all their needs. So have you ever looked at this dual complicity to change your morality or your culture depending on the needs of where you are?
That's interesting. So yeah, if I am following you correctly, it's not even just style switching in some ways, but there might be a deeper switch that occurs and it's activated by a different context. Is that where you're going, Jorge?
That's where I'm going. It's switched by the context, and you need to survive, basically. The corporate guys make their salary, obviously, in other parts. And I've been doing a little bit of research on it, and I've seen it because I'm trying to work with law enforcement, and they tend to switch that thing, And it's something that's not much research on it. I'm trying to find as much as I can. And, you want to discuss this in some other time. And that's what I see from a political perspective. And you saw that in the current version, and you see it in corporate life.
So the research that I think would be aligned with that, and I'm happy to connect if you want to talk more, Jorge, but this notion of code switching. So you may want to take a look at some of the papers that are in that area. There's the one that I can think of in particular is Molinsky 2007. So it's almost like when we think about deep acting versus surface acting when it comes to emotional intelligence, and this again, kind of aligned in a lot of ways. So I would take a look if you're looking for research in that area under code switching. That might be helpful for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Other questions or comments?
Prof. Richard, this is Yati here, if I
Hi,
may
Yati.
speak. Hi, just a comment on what I didn't get the name of the speaker before you was talking about culture code switching, or what I call as always as a culture code switching.
Yeah.
There is a stream of literature that really speaks about the behavior of people when they are encountering different cultures, and I'm doing that. And I think when I was doing my dissertation like years ago, I stumble into that particular behavior where when we talk about different contexts, high context and low context, we do get that kind of behavior where high context people tend to switch more than low context people or low context culture, for the reason high context culture really wants to get into that accommodation behavior, accommodative behavior. And it is really based on the goal of relationship building, building rapport with people. Therefore, you tend to become more accommodative when you're speaking, for example. And I know that for sure because when I was doing content analysis of about 1,600 emails, I see that behavior is surfacing. And I know nowadays when we want to teach or we want to train people in order for them to really be acculturative to the other culture, we tend to do that code switching. So you might want to look at code switching behavior in the communication literature if it helps you.
So Jorge, just so you know, Yati is an expert in this. I was just reviewing a paper of hers on code switching. I think it was yesterday. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that applies except to the Dutch.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole. Don't get me going down that path. I'll try to be culturally competent about that. But yeah, you connect with Yati because she knows all about this. She can really help you get a better understanding of that literature.
Okay, I'll contact Curtis. I will assume Curtis has your email.
Great. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Yati. Appreciate it. Any other questions or comments?
Yes, I have a question, Rich.
Yes, sure.
So you've been teaching cross-cultural management to all kinds of audiences. College students, obviously, in all kinds of countries, but also the military personnel, employees, even people who are thinking about going to Mars. So which of those audiences is the hardest one to work with? Or which of those sort of are most receptive to the idea that culture matters, and perhaps which one is denying that culture matters and think that it's all about technical skills, perhaps? I'm just curious for myself.
That's a really good question. So what I would say, and this has happened over a number of years. I would say traditionally the toughest nut to crack, if you want to think about it, had been business people. So when I talked to executives, they had other variables they were more concerned about. So they were more concerned about market share, or they were more concerned about scalability, these kinds of traditional business issues that occurred. But that's changed over time. So what I used to have to do is I used to have to sell the need, and you'd have to get a conversation going to where people realized they had a problem, and then you could get into the solution. And that, I would say, has changed, at least with what is a sub-sample, and we're doing much more work now that I would call strategic cultural competence, where we're thinking about it at a higher level, and you are pushing interventions from the C-level down rather than from HR up. As you all well know, HR in most organizations, and I'm going to get punched for this, I'm sure there's an HR professional in the group, but HR doesn't have any juice at the executive table. They are not viewed as an influential partner. They're viewed as a cost sink, usually not as a revenue generator. And so that people don't love HR. Whereas you get a COO that says they want to push this through the organization, everybody does it. So I would say businesses had been more resistant to these concepts than what I'd seen in the military, what I'd seen in space exploration, what I've seen with students, but that's changed. And I think we're moving in the right direction. I don't know where we'll be in a few years ago. That global pendulum is swinging back. There's a lot of populism that is driving thinking right now. But, you know, and any change that's occurred, what I've learned over time is just sit still, wait a minute, and that pendulum will swing back the other way in just a few years. So, Boss, I don't know if that
that's very interesting. Yeah, I was kind of hoping that the business people are most receptive, because if it gives them an advantage, you know, saves extra or improves performance by extra 2-3%, they will jump on the. And I thought maybe the military, you know, being so hierarchical, maybe they have, you know, sort of set in their ways, but it seems like it's the opposite. So that's interesting.
Well, I mean, so I would say you're absolutely right. In terms of business, what I do is I do a two-step approach. I never say the word culture when I am starting business development. I'll just say something about, hey, do you want to reduce your risk? Do you want to reduce your cost? Do you want to cut down on the amount of time if you're doing international business? And of course, the answers to all those are yes, I really want to do that. And then we get into what might be causing more risk or what might be causing things to take longer. And often that is a cultural variable that is in play. So that's just a strategy that we've used over time, and you know, from business development, is to kind of take a two-step approach. But if I say culture coming out of the gate, oh my God, they're done with me before I finish my sentence. They'll still be nice and they nod but they're already off in some other variable.
Interesting. Although you may be, I mean, probably you're right. I mean, I've noticed that much of this cross-cultural training and cultural awareness training is done purely for the compliance reasons. I mean, they need to do it, so they do it. So maybe you're right. So maybe they do it just because they have to, rather than because they believe in it.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on, particularly in the diversity field. And Curtis and I were just chatting about that. I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars that will be spent this year in the area of diversity simply for compliance. And people aren't looking for actual outcomes that can improve their organizational effectiveness, which to me, then that's just a lot of money that's getting flushed down the drain. I'd rather see a more effective interventions put in place.
Amen.
Yeah, and I assume most of the time when you do training, if you ask if they would like you to do a proper utility analysis, the effectiveness of training, in most cases, they probably say, oh, that's okay, we trust it's working, we don't really need the exact numbers. At least that's my experience. Usually they don't really want a rigorous evaluation.
I would say most human resource executives that I work with are actually afraid of an evaluation, because if they spent $500,000 on a program and it doesn't work, they're in trouble. So they would just rather believe it worked than see that it worked. Now that's not true across all, and I don't want to disparage that field too much, but yeah, I would say you're right. You know, strong evaluation, particularly at what is a behavioral or results level of evaluation, isn't something that a company is often interested in investing in. They may look at reactions, but you know, you all know that too. I mean, we call those happy sheets.
Yeah, so, smiley faces.
Yeah, that's it. You know, if I make the group giggle a little bit, I get a good evaluation, and then the company pretends to be happy, and I pretend to be paid, and we go our separate ways.
Yep. Thank you.
Sure. So another question.
It's actually another question. It might trigger a question. I don't know. What I have seen with executive also is, for whatever reason, the majority that I had the chance to talk to, or if they realize that maybe there's a blind spot in their structure, the first reaction is, it's going to be great for my team. And I'm always about to say, well, we should start with you. For whatever reason, once you get to a high level, there's that notion that the training is good for the people below. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right, Claire. Absolutely. So one of the things that we've done, and I don't know if you've had success at this or not, but what we've tried to do is, if we have some kind of intervention at an executive level, we try to build failure in early, so that the executives actually experience failure, and it brings a little humility into the equation, and then they might be more open, because executives, by definition, I mean, these are hyper competitive people. And if they have a failure in front of other peers, they want to fix that, because that's a weakness, and their peers will go at that. So we actually put them in situations, and I'd be happy to talk about this offline. I probably would spend too much time, but we put them in a situation where it's guaranteed they're going to fail. And then they do, and you all of a sudden see the look in their eyes. Wait a minute, maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did. And that frees up their learning for what is at least a half a day. And then we try to sneak a smaller amount of failure, and then we tail it off a little bit. so that we can get, you know, more engagement from those folks who are getting coaching. Does that help, Claire?
Yeah, it does.
Fantastic. So Curtis, I don't know, I think we probably have time for one more question. Is that okay, Curtis?
Yeah, and if I could get that question, that'd be great.
Oh, awesome, Curtis. Perfect.
So first of all, I want to thank everyone for all the questions, and especially I want to thank you, Rich, for sharing this thought-provoking presentation with a focus on all of these different disciplines, focusing on culture and intercultural communications, you know, from the business perspective, and cultural anthropology and psychology. So my question will be a big picture question. Okay. As we wrap up the meeting here, for all of us who have cut our teeth on Edward T. Hall and Trompenars and other classic, now classic pieces of literature from the cross-cultural domain, what would be the top 2 or 3 things that you'd recommend we do to begin to approach this a little differently with the brain in mind?
Yeah. So this is off the top of my head, but one of the things that I think is when I don't think I know something, which is every day, you know, I run into an area where I don't know enough. What I try to do is find someone who does. So I guess my first bit of advice would be collaborate. You know, you start to find people who have some expertise in, and what would be the areas? Well, you could go back to that table and you take a look at any of those areas that are looking at these topics that you're not in, you know, and you might then start thinking about, what does my network look like? And, you know, I had a chance to kind of peruse a lot of your backgrounds on LinkedIn before we had this topic or this session. So you can do the same, and you start to look for people who might be examining a similar phenomenon from a different perspective, and, you know, have conversation with them, or find out what meetings are they going to. And so that to me is an important one, in that you got to know what you don't know. And, you know, approaching that with what is a sense of humility, which is the one thing I love about working with cross-cultural trainers. Probably one of the most humble groups you're ever going to meet, because culture will humble you pretty fast. It's hard to be smart when you don't know the rules. And then I think the other element of it that I think is important is to realize that what we've read and what we've become experts in is not an objective reality, and that it's a framework that's helped us understand a phenomenon, but it's not correct or right. So this is one I get asked all the time. Doesn't matter where I'm at. What is the correct framework, cultural framework, Rich? Is it Hofstede? Is it Trompenars? Is it Hall? Is it Schwartz? And the answer I always give is it's none of them. None of them are correct. They are useful or they're not. And what I find is that I find some useful in some situations. If I'm working at an executive level, I might pull power distance. If I'm looking at the use of rules, I might look at universalism versus particularism. And I switch gears depending on what I need in the moment, you know. So it's just a way to slice up the pie. And, you know, if you're going to eat pie, if I cut it into 4 pieces, does it taste different than if I cut it into 8? No, it's the same. It's a pie. If I just reach in the middle and grab a handful and eat it, is it different? No, it's a pie. So, you know, culture is the pie. How we slice it up and how we explain it, there's useful and non-useful. And I think, to me, that's helpful. So if you're collaborating with people who are experts in other areas, if you're recognizing that the way that you understand and view the world is arbitrary in many ways, and, you know, is it useful for you to hang on to? Well, then hang on to those useful parts, but realize that it's not air or water. These are not objective truths per se. They're just ways for us to explain these differences. So those are just some thoughts. I don't know if there's any value in those or not, Curtis. Talk about, we were talking about my ability to bullshit. That was, I think, the best bullshitting answer I've had in a long time.
Well, quite an eclectic answer, but one that satisfies me. I've got a whole plate of things I can still use when they come in handy, like power distance, like low context and high context.
Yep.
So again, Rich, I want to thank you for coming in today, and thank everyone for coming into the presentation. And Rich, I look forward to continuing this discussion at some time.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to chat with me today. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to chat with any of you on a number of these things if you want to follow up. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you all soon.
Bye.